The fines started quietly. There was no confrontation, no dramatic warning, and no sense that anything unusual was happening. The first notice looked routine, almost procedural. It referenced a minor violation and included a small fine, framed as a temporary measure that would stop once the issue was resolved. The language suggested cooperation, not conflict. It implied the problem was simple and easily fixable. I did not agree with the violation, but I assumed it would be handled through the usual back and forth. I responded in writing, asked for clarification, and requested documentation. I expected a pause, maybe a hearing, or at least a response addressing my questions. Instead, the next week, another fine appeared. Same violation, same amount, new date. At first, I thought it was an administrative delay. Maybe my response had not been processed yet. Maybe the system was automated. I sent another message, referencing my earlier email and reiterating that the violation was disputed. I asked again for confirmation of the enforcement process. There was no response. The following week, another fine was issued. That was the moment the pattern became clear. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a strategy. The HOA was issuing weekly fines without engaging in any resolution process. Each notice was nearly identical to the last, with the same language and the same violation code. The only thing that changed was the date and the growing total amount owed. There was no mention of a hearing, no acknowledgement of my dispute, just repetition. Weekly enforcement changes the psychology of a dispute. A single fine can be contested calmly. Repeated fines create pressure. They turn a disagreement into a countdown. The longer you wait, the more expensive resistance becomes. That pressure is not accidental. It is designed to force compliance without discussion. I reviewed the governing documents again, this time specifically looking for anything that authorized recurring penalties. The bylaws described enforcement procedures in detail. Notices, cure periods, hearings, escalation steps. Fines were allowed, but they were conditional. They required due process. They required notice and an opportunity to be heard. They did not authorize automatic weekly penalties without review. What was happening did not match what was written. I requested a hearing formally, citing the relevant sections of the bylaws. I sent the request through the management company and directly to the board. I asked that enforcement be paused until the dispute was resolved. I received a brief reply stating that the violation was ongoing and that fines would continue until compliance was achieved. That response avoided the question entirely. The fines continued. Week after week, new notices arrived. The total grew large enough to feel threatening. Late fees were mentioned. Collection language began to appear. The tone shifted from administrative to coercive. The message was clear: comply now, or the cost will keep rising. At that point, it was no longer about the original issue. It was about the method of enforcement. The HOA was using time as a weapon. I stopped responding emotionally and started documenting everything. I created a timeline showing each fine, each notice, each unanswered request. I highlighted the lack of hearings and the absence of any board review. When everything was laid out visually, the abuse was obvious. This was not enforcement. It was accumulation. I consulted the governing documents one more time, then checked state HOA statutes. The law was clear. Fines could not be imposed indefinitely without due process. Repeated penalties for the same unresolved violation, without hearings or board action, could be challenged as excessive and improper. In some cases, they could be deemed unenforceable. That was when I changed tactics. Instead of disputing the violation itself, I challenged the enforcement structure. I sent a formal written notice stating that I disputed the validity of the recurring fines, that required procedures had not been followed, and that continued issuance would be contested. I requested a full accounting of the fines, documentation of board approval, and confirmation of any hearings that had been scheduled. I did not argue. I did not accuse. I asked for records. The response took longer than usual. When it arrived, it was different. The management company stated that the matter was under review. No new fines were issued that week. The silence broke the pattern, and that break mattered. It meant the system was not as automatic as it appeared. A week passed. Then another.
No fines.
Eventually, a notice arrived stating that enforcement was being paused pending a hearing. That hearing should have happened months earlier. When it finally did, The weekly fines were addressed for the first time. The board could not explain why they had been issued without review. There was no record of approval, no documentation showing compliance with the bylaws. The outcome was predictable. The fines were withdrawn. The accumulated balance was removed. Enforcement was reset. But the real change was broader. After that point, the HOA stopped issuing recurring fines altogether. Violations were handled with notices and cure periods. Hearings were scheduled when required. The weekly accumulation tactic disappeared, not because it was corrected publicly, but because it had been exposed. This experience revealed a common enforcement shortcut used by HOAs. Weekly fines feel powerful because they grow quietly. They rely on inertia. Most homeowners pay to stop the bleeding, even if they believe the violation is wrong. The tactic works because resistance feels expensive. What stopped it was not compliance. It was structure. By forcing the HOA to confront its own procedures, the enforcement collapsed. The fines did not stop because the violation was resolved. They stopped because the method could not survive scrutiny. That is the lesson most homeowners never learn. You do not always have to fight the rule. Sometimes, you fight the process. And when the process fails, the pressure disappears. Once the fine stopped, I understood something important. The HOA had never been confident in its enforcement strategy. Confidence had been simulated through repetition, not supported by procedure. Weekly fines only work as long as no one forces the system to explain itself. The moment documentation is demanded, the entire mechanism slows down. The hearing that followed was revealing, not because of what was said, but because of what was missing. The board members present reviewed the violation as if they were seeing it for the first time. Questions were asked that should have been resolved months earlier. No one could explain why the same fine had been issued week after week without escalation or review. No one could identify the vote that authorized that approach. The enforcement had become automatic, detached from oversight. That detachment mattered. HOA enforcement is supposed to involve judgment. Repeated fines for a single unresolved issue are not meant to operate like a subscription. They require reassessment. They require board involvement. Without that, fines stop being corrective and start becoming punitive. And punitive enforcement without due process is where legal risk begins. The board attempted to frame the situation as a misunderstanding, suggesting that the management company had acted independently. But the management company pointed back to board policy. That circular deflection revealed a deeper issue. No one was actually supervising the enforcement process. The weekly fines existed because no one had taken responsibility for stopping them. That realization triggered broader concern. Other homeowners began reviewing their own records. Some discovered similar patterns: recurring fines that had never been reviewed, penalties that continued long after disputes were raised, balances that grew without explanation. What had felt like isolated pressure was, in fact, a systemic shortcut. The HOA responded by quietly changing its procedures. There was no announcement, but enforcement guidelines were updated. Management was instructed to pause fines once disputes were filed. Hearings were scheduled earlier. Recurring penalties required explicit approval. These changes were framed as clarifications, but they were corrections. The legal implications were clear. Repeated fines without process expose HOAs to claims of improper enforcement. Accumulated penalties can be challenged as excessive. In some jurisdictions, courts have ruled that fines must be proportional and connected to active review. Weekly accumulation, especially when disputes are ignored, fails that standard. The HOA understood this risk once it became visible. From that point on, communication changed. Notices became more detailed. Cure periods were emphasized. Enforcement language softened. The assumption that fines could simply continue indefinitely disappeared. What replaced it was caution. That shift did not happen because of cooperation. It happened because resistance became informed. What most homeowners never realize is that enforcement strategies are often built around expectation, not authority. HOAs expect compliance because compliance is common. They expect silence because silence is easier than confrontation. Weekly fines exploit that expectation by making resistance feel expensive. The turning point is not when fines are paid or forgiven. It is when the enforcement logic is exposed. When the HOA is forced to explain not just what it is enforcing, but how and why, shortcuts collapse. In my case, The violation itself was never the real issue. The issue was the accumulation. The HOA assumed that cost would break resistance before procedure could be questioned. That assumption failed. The long-term effect was subtle but lasting. The HOA became more deliberate. Enforcement slowed. Disputes were addressed earlier. The weekly fine tactic vanished, not just for me, but for everyone. What had once been a quiet pressure tool was now recognized as a liability. This is how many HOA abuses end, not with confrontation, but with exposure. Not with victory speeches, but with silence. The fines stopped. The balance disappeared. And the system adjusted itself to avoid being tested again. The lesson is simple but uncomfortable for HOAs. Enforcement must withstand scrutiny. If it cannot be explained, documented, and justified step by step, it will eventually fail. Weekly fines feel powerful because they grow invisibly. But invisible pressure depends on ignorance. Once that ignorance is gone, the pressure loses its force. That is what finally stopped the fines. Not compliance, not negotiation, but forcing the process into the light.